Good evening, everyone. I join Payal in welcoming all of you here today. It's always a miracle how many of you come on a weekday, and there truly is a heartfelt thank you for that. There are other colleagues who join me in welcoming all of you. There's Nina, Anjali, Shuli, and Ritu, who are always there behind the scenes. Many of you know them, but all of us really welcome you here today. There's some of you who are new, so I'd just like to say one line about algebra and why we call this club Algebra. For most of us, algebra is the nightmare of our childhoods, but it actually means something wonderful. It means the science of restoration and balance. And that is something throughout the entire journey of algebra that we have really sought, to find the middle ground, to find synthesis in a time of extreme polarities. And there, the first speaker today is somebody through whom we can seek an idea of synthesis and middle ground at a time when it feels that we really are at the outer edges of polarities. And before I introduce him, I wanted to share a few quick figures, which many of you might be familiar with, but it's always stark to hear them. Every month, 12 million Indians join the work market. 100 million Indians are looking for work. And last year, we created just 0.1 million jobs. 90% of India lives in the informal sector and is responsible for jobs in this country. In the 20 years since liberalization, or indeed more than 20 years, manufacturing has only created about 10.5 million jobs, out of which 3.7 million are in the formal sector. The rest are in the informal sector. In the last 2 years, the top 1% of India's wealth has increased from 48% to 59% just in the last 2 years. Whereas the bottom 50% of India still owns only 2% of India's wealth. 6% of India, 2% of India's labor is skilled labor. Almost 20% of IIT graduates are the only ones who are employable. The rest are really unemployable. A World Bank report says that in the next 10 odd years, India is going to lose 69% of its existing jobs. 640,000 technological jobs are going to be lost, and many of those who are in the technology sector today are going to become irrelevant. The e-commerce sector, we know, is in great trouble. And the list can go on. And here's the starkest one we never think about, which is that 45% of Indians are stunted. They are stunted emotionally, physically, intellectually, incapable of work, unemployable, because they are victims of malnutrition. So that's just the broad strokes of India, and one could carry on and on. So it doesn't require a futurist to tell us that India is in trouble, no matter what we say. People tell us, again, futurists say the 21st century is going to belong to those who can think critically, creatively, people who are going to be collaborators and innovators. And here, 45% of this country is stunted. How are we going to exist in this new world? Now, that crisis of India is situated in a larger global crisis, which is accelerated because this is a time when there is a blowback on globalization, there's extreme migration, there's robotization, there is technology, there is the climate change that is catching up with us, and there is extreme social unrest arising out of, one, access to great information, and two, social inequity. And just two figures captures that. In America, they're now talking not about the 1% that owns 99% of America's wealth, but the 0.01% that owns pretty much all of America's wealth. And in India, I've already shared with you that figure. And I'll throw one more in just before we get into the actual session, which is that just in the last 2 years, or last year, we've had a 135% increase in non-performing assets by corporate companies. And that's really all the non-performing assets, the bad loans, add up to 43 billion, out of which 30 defaulters account for 1/3. So that's the picture we really are in India. How India, situated in this larger global crisis, is going to survive in the next 10, 20, 15 years. The man we have here today is well positioned to give us some insight into this. Because mostly it's Mr. Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao who are credited with opening up India's economy in 1991. But this is the man who wrote the secret paper on which that entire opening up of India's economy was really based. As deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, he held one of the most contentious and difficult jobs in the country. He was tasked to face the challenges of India, to find economic answers to ethical and governance issues, and to really take on the riddles of India. But he wasn't just manning the riddles of India. In many ways, he epitomized them. Because here was a man who came from believing in left-centered economic policies and politics to becoming somebody who was a staunch defender of the free market. He was part of the World Bank, the IMF. And then when he took over as deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, he was really leading a Soviet-style institution with a further twist that left to itself, it would not have supported any welfare schemes in India at all. And so here we have Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, one of the most brilliant economists in the country, and somebody who can really take on the question, not just of analyzing the past and the present, but of giving us some answers to the future. What is that heretical new idea that India needs, which can pull us out of the situation that we are in today? So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Montek, as I said, there are many questions to throw at you, and I really want to divide up the conversation in three parts, analyzing the present, the past, and some prognosis for the future. So I'm going to start with the present. Over the last 2 days, the country and pretty much the world has been surprised by the new GDP figures, which says that in these 3 months, when demonetization hit us the most, that India was really galloping at a 7%. So there are many theories around that. There is the accusation that these figures have been massaged and that we no longer can trust our central statistics offices. There's also a sense that the figures are not massaged, but the real question here is, how much do we really know about Indian economy at all? Is the GDP any indication of what's really going on in India? What is your own take on it?
Well, can I be heard? Yeah. No, I think those of you who've read the newspapers yesterday and today, I think Pranab Sen, who's the former chief statistician, he's probably said the most balanced thing about the last quarter's results. As he put it, I mean, basically, the economy was, in my view, clearly hit, and it was the informal sector that was hit the most. The formal sector was not that much hit. And the problem really is that he believes, and he points out, that we only measure what happens in the informal sector at the end of a year. So when we give these quarterly estimates, what we usually do is sort of assume that the informal sector grew pretty much the way the formal sector did. And then he's pointed out that there are particular reasons why maybe the formal sector didn't show even a slight decline. And the reason for that is that, people were pushing out their production to their retail distribution chains. The problem was accumulation of inventories at the retail level, okay, or the distributor level. But the production kept on going, and they were able to use old notes which could still be used to pay excise duty. So you got a big bump up in excise duties. Production was shown as having increased. But if there is a slowdown, it's like, scooters and things, if the rural demand is squeezed, it's in the last quarter of the year that you'll see the inventories won't be run down, in which case probably if people find that inventories at the dealer's end are piling up, they'll slow down their production. When they do that, then the informal sector will be correspondingly slowed down too. My guess is that certainly GDP was hit. A lot of people say, somewhere probably we'll end the year with GDP lower than 7%. Most of the financial analysts and the various investment firms that look at this on a regular basis have been talking about 6.6% and so on. Now, mind you, 6.6% is still quite good. That's a separate issue that, there's a lot of buoyancy in the Indian economy for a variety of reasons. So that's a slightly confused answer, but
so let me pinpoint you on that answer, which is that, in your view, was demonetization a good move or a bad move economically?
You see, I've written about this. In my view, I don't particularly think it was necessary. When it was introduced, the reasons given were that, you know, somehow it will freeze a lot of black wealth held in cash. And if it had done so, you could argue that it's frozen something. I mean, that black wealth held in cash is a very small part of the total black wealth, but whatever it is, it would have been a gain. Now, we don't know how much it has actually frozen because they aren't giving the numbers. But the approximate numbers that have been put out, that, you know, instead of 30% of the outstanding currency being frozen, it'll be about 4 or 5%. So that objective just isn't there.
But, you know, when you were giving the technical answer for why the GDP is not representing or reflecting the distress that anecdotally one knows was felt during these months, the point is that politically it has been extremely expedient and fortunate for the BJP government to have a GDP figure like this, especially when elections are on, because it makes it seem as if there was really no costs to that. So again, the question I would pose to you is that both as an economist and possibly a political opponent, how would you rate the way the Modi dispensation has handled the economy in the 3 years that it's been in power? On 10, what would you give it?
Well, you know, I really don't like giving numbers, but
But you are a numbers man.
No. The truth is that in these 3 years, there's been a pickup. I mean, they came in at a time when the economy had slowed down, but had begun to pick up. That pickup has continued. Look, the basic policies that the government is following, and this is to the credit of India, they're not gone and reversed anything. There's really a continuation of what was being done. Of course, the government will say that they're doing it better than the previous dispensation did. You know, if you believe that India has a really strong underlying buoyancy, then a continuation of policy would see that continue. And I think from that point of view, you would have to say that the buoyancy has continued. Now, I'm just talking about the economic side, not the social side. There are lots of concerns that can be expressed on the social side. But I think on the economic side, I mean, if you ask what is the policy is not very different from what was there before.
So I'm going to come back to that to, you know, in fact, talk about the rifts that there were in your own government between these policies of some degree of social welfare and the desire to accelerate growth. And in fact, it was a big rift in your government. And this government was very antithetical to it. You were criticized for the food program, for the NREGA. Mr. Modi really went out to say he would wrap it up. It was a shame that 60 years later, Congress had to have these programs. So I'm going to wind back to that question. But when you're saying that the economy is buoyant, I just shared some fairly shock figures. One, that really jobs seems to be in extreme crisis. And the fact that last year we only generated 1.35 lakh jobs in 8 labor-intensive sectors. And yes, there may be some more in the service sector, but overall, when you look at the figures, this is a ticking time bomb that we don't seem to be addressing. What's your own sense of that? That is the future of jobs really the big question in India today?
I think that is a big question. And again, you know, this is not something which distinguishes this government from the previous government. Because this whole, let me step back. Please disregard all the numbers that you hear, because the area where our data are truly lousy is in employment. I mean, most of these numbers that you hear do not actually come from serious official statistics. They're pulled out from different parts of the record. What is true is that quite a lot of jobs are being created, but they're informal sector jobs. It's absolutely true that not enough formal sector jobs are being created. And the demand now, particularly as the population becomes more educated, and people are also more aware of progress. You know, the explosion of television, if nothing else, you look at the television advertisements. You know, I have a theory that if you construct an index, how close are TV advertisements to the sort of consumption style of, say, the middle 40, 50% of the population? If you watch TV in the United States, most of the things advertised on TV are things which people in that category can actually buy. That's not true of our TV. I mean, our advertisements are all sort of a huge range of things which only the top 5% can actually afford. So this is being beamed all over the country. So there's a lot of expectation, aspirations, and one of the key aspirations is I must get a secure, formal sector job. That is not happening.
But Montek,
But they're getting jobs. I mean, you know, if you look at the only data that we have on poverty is actually during the UPA period, 2004 to 2011. Now, this was a period when, first of all, GDP growth was the highest ever, but poverty reduction was remarkable. I mean, for the first time, the absolute number of people below the poverty line fell. But the point is that people are no longer very satisfied if you tell them that congratulations, you've gone above this lousy poverty line. They say, look here, I mean, I haven't got a decent job. And I mean, therefore the shortfall from expectation is high. And any government would have to deal with that.
But Montek, we always seem to discount numbers when it's inconvenient for us. And you know, you mentioned the poverty line. I'm amazed at your courage because you do remember that caught you in a real maelstrom, which was the reduction of the poverty.
Utterly irrational propagandist nonsense. I mean, really.
Watch out, you're beginning to sound like the Modi government now. You know?
No, I'm not. I mean,
calling
look,
everything propaganda.
I think the propaganda about the poverty line, I'm making a limited point. Somebody got up and said, first of all, by the way, it wasn't the Planning Commission's poverty line. It was an expert group. And as a matter of fact, at that time, when the Tendulkar poverty line was set up, the BJP criticized the government for having a ridiculous poverty line, forgetting that only a few years earlier, they had an even lower one. I mean, Tendulkar actually raised the poverty line. And you know, we said, okay, if you think this is not good, let's bring Rangarajan in. So another expert group came. They also raised the poverty line. The proposition I'm making that numbers below the poverty line fell is valid whether you raise the poverty line or lower. It's just the absolute number increases, but the decline is still there. And you know, it's interesting that I was interviewed on television and people said, 32 rupees per person per day. I mean, that's ridiculous. So I said, you know, for a family, that's 150 rupees per day. That's 4,500 rupees per month. Poverty line, by the way. And your minimum wage at that time was roughly there. So nobody was saying that the poverty line is a line of satisfaction. It was meant to be an absolute rock bottom survival line. And instead of focusing on whether things were getting better, the whole focus was on, you know, that the Planning Commission is somehow saying poverty's been removed, which, by the way, we weren't. We were saying it's gone down from, whatever, 400 million to 260 million.
Well, I must grant that even your worst adversaries would grant that, like you said, absolute numbers of the poor, and definitely the middle class has increased in all these years. So, you know, we'll bypass that, though it is a moot question that, you know, to live on rupees 32 a day is not just a line of non-satisfaction. It's actually not possible to survive in that. And I could reel out numbers on that, but we'll let that pass for now.
Not in Gurgaon, by the way, but you know, if you go to many parts of rural areas, if you said family income 4,500 rupees a month, I mean, it's not a comfortable living, but it is rock bottom. Nobody's denying that.
Okay, so I'm going to continue with a few more questions about the present before taking on your past, Montek. But in that, you know, continuing with this question about jobs, you mentioned, and many figures bear it out, that number may be different, but a majority of jobs are part of the non-formal sector.
Yeah.
And repeatedly, you know, we are being shown that it is almost impossible now to generate the number of formal jobs that we need. Because, again, because of robotization, you know, it's now a given that the world cannot afford another China, that there isn't possibility to saturated economies can't buy another China. Climate change is not going to allow India to become China. And manufacturing jobs are not being created at that pace. Formal jobs, the tech sector, the e-commerce sector, all of them really are in trouble. The part which is robustly carrying on looking after itself is really the informal sector. But there is great disdain amongst the intellectuals and economists and television studios for the informal sector. And so the question I'm putting to you is that, is there necessity for a change in thinking about the informal sector? In fact, is that the way of the future? We have 440 million people who need jobs. You can't create that in factories.
Well, no, I do think you need you need to make a distinction between different things. First, you know, in many people's minds, the idea of a job, employment equals job, that I become a wage-earning worker as opposed to a self-employed semi-entrepreneur, this attitude has to change. What is a guy who drives an Uber car? Is he a self-employed guy who takes out his car whenever he gets a call, or is he a wage employee? So when people say a lot of jobs are going to be destroyed, that's true. But what's going to happen is they're going to be replaced by other jobs. So I don't think these World Bank numbers, by the way, the World Bank also says that, I think for India, it's about 50%. It's in America, they say 67% or something like that of the jobs that exist won't be there. Because technology is going to change the nature of people's involvement. Having said that, I think it's true that we will find, certainly in the West and maybe even here, we'll need less people to do a lot of the production that otherwise used to be done with more people. Look, Keynes said this a long time ago, that, suppose it was possible to produce all the GDP that is currently produced by so many people with maybe 1/10 the people. Is that a bad thing? Because in terms of productivity, it might allow others to spend their time in more civilized ways, providing you can redistribute this income. So you need a total social change in how people will be given income support, from what mechanisms, which societies can afford it. And this is as big a problem in the United States as it will be here. So we need to think afresh.
But isn't that one of history's ironies, that when so-called left-leaning intellectuals were promoting a basic threshold of humanity, which is, various welfare schemes that will allow people to at least come to a level playing field, a level economic playing field, there was extreme opposition to that, including from you, and like I said,
not from me, by the way. I don't remember opposing this. You may have thought I was opposing it.
I could quote you chapter and verse on your resistance, say, for the food program, for the...
No, let's be clear. I was in favor of a cash transfer. I was not in favor of a ludicrous system where procurement and government-run shops and so on. I had no problem with saying that India needs to spend whatever it is, 70,000 crores in order to help the poor. But my view was, why don't we give them as a straight cash transfer? And, there were umpteen reasons why people didn't like the idea, but that's because whenever you have a system, the people who run the system get very possessive about it. But if you think about it, it's not clear to me that if you want to help the poor, particularly these days with UIDAI, Aadhaar, this, that, and the other, I would just say that, when you've identified people who are eligible for food security, let the woman in the household simply receive that amount of money. In many cases, by the way, the distribution of food rather than cash is not advantageous. If she already has 1 acre or whatever it is of land, what's the point of giving her cheap wheat? It's much better to give her cash. She'll go and buy more vegetables or milk or eggs or whatever it is. So that was my concern. I'm not against the basic idea of giving income support.
So just to finish
my idea was not acceptable, by the way, because people wanted to do it just this way.
No, I think the question there again, and I'm going to ask you that, is that today it's being proven again and again that that political intention of investing, and I make the difference between saying investing rather than spending on health and education, is proving to be the great imperative of our time, and in fact, most liberal economies, Germany, elsewhere, it's always been the state that invested in that, to create robust economies. And it's surprising how conflicted that debate is in India. But to complete my point, it's now ironic that it is high capitalism that has come up with the idea of a universal basic income. And it's really the Bretton Woods institutions and others that are now thinking of passing on a universal basic income to the world so that some can keep doing the work and making the money, and you just basically keep social unrest at bay. But again, to give you that odd number, that the number that was put out by the National Economic Survey this time was to pass on 1,000 rupees to every individual. Now that's again ludicrous, you know. So I come back to it, Montek, that are there not very big thorny questions facing India, which we seem to dance around by talking about the small pieces? You said India's buoyant. Do you genuinely believe that the Indian economic situation is buoyant?
Look, my definition of buoyant is that the GDP is increasing. That doesn't mean that all problems are solved. But we could have all these problems and the GDP could be growing at 2%. That would be an unmitigated disaster. Even at 5%, it would be a disaster. So when I say it's buoyant, what I mean is that 7% GDP growth is not as good as it's been over the last 11 years, but it's not bad. And given what's happening in the world, I mean, the vast majority of countries would be delighted to have 7% growth. That doesn't mean, by the way, that everybody's income is growing at 7%. I mean, in any of these high growth scenarios, some people are getting more, some people are losing out, and you have to address those weaknesses. So I don't deny
You know,
that.
the difficulty of posing these questions is that it automatically makes one seem as though one is opposed to GDP growth, which one is not. Well, I think that's a given. I think the point that one constantly tries to make is that does it mean that too much focus gets put merely on that parameter, and that should there be more attention in reinforcing and making the informal sector more robust?
No, hang on. Two separate questions. One is that at least when I was involved in the Planning Commission, the first plan that the 11th plan that I was involved in, we called it rapid and inclusive growth. So growth and inclusion. In the next one, there's the 12th plan, which is ended now. We said rapid, inclusive, and sustainable. So, you know, insofar as identifying what is important, there's no question, nobody was going around saying growth is everything. If you ask me, I would say that if you just look at growth for the last 11, 12 years, India's performance is excellent. If you look at inclusiveness, it's a bit mixed. I mean, there's been some progress, like all this poverty reduction. There's been progress in every other dimension also, but much less than there should have been. Where it's a disaster is sustainability. Because you construct whatever index you want of sustainability, air pollution, water pollution, you name it. The indices are worse than they were 10 years ago. The only good thing you can say about our efforts is that, but for those efforts, they would have been even worse. So that's my ranking, you know, good. And remember, 15 years ago, we weren't even good on growth. So it's normal that, you know, you tackle a problem and a sign of success is, okay, been there, done that, then something else comes up, you've got to tackle that, and so on. And in that sense, the sustainability issue is the one that has surfaced most recently. And, you know, we'll just have to get more involved and more people have to understand. I think one of the big problems with these solutions is that, you know, first of all, we understand much less about these things than we did about growth. Because remember, the developing countries, the better ones, started growing rapidly in the 1960s. We just went on doing our stuff and not learning any lessons. So by the time we got around to doing something, this was a known thing. When it came to health and education, we knew what the Western countries were doing. But you know, most developing countries weren't doing a good job either. And when it comes to sustainability, even the West has only woken up to it relatively recently. But that's not an excuse for, I think we need much greater involvement on the part of ordinary people. I mean, and concerned citizens, we've got a lot of concerned citizens here, to understand that, look, if you really want a better, whatever, quality of air, you've got to ask your politician, what are you doing about A, B, and C? I mean, I was talking to Vicky Bhartram short while ago, and he's absolutely right that the one question you should ask is, can we accelerate the move to Bharat 6, which is just Euro 6? Makes a big difference. there will be huge lobbying to delay it, can't be done, this, that, and the other. But I don't think the public is even aware that this is what they've got to watch out for. So I think increasingly, both at the central and the state level, you've got to pose certain issues to the political class and say, look, are you willing to stand up for X, Y, and Z?
Well, Montek, I was going to come to your past a little later, but I'm now going to cycle back to the present later because, you've been giving fairly good marks to this government, and it's great. And I think that, we had Mr. Chidambaram here earlier, and he did that. And I must say that's extreme political courtesy on your behalf, because that's not a courtesy that was extended to all of you. But that's great if you feel that. The thing is that there is also, and I must say it's anecdotal, that there is a sense that corporate growth is at a stasis, that the Make in India has not really been that, that successful. Manufacturing is not growing, exports is not growing. There is a sense of a stasis everywhere.
Yes.
And,
No, I agree with
but
that.
you think that that's good science?
No, what I'm saying is that you take a 3-4 year, if you ask me what are the problems right now, I would say first, clearly exports, but globally exports are doing badly. So you can't really blame the local scene for that, though you have to do something about it. That's one side. The really bad scene is that investment has been on a downturn, and the new government has done nothing to reverse that. So that's a big issue. Why is it on a downturn? It's what you mentioned yourself. I don't believe that in a dynamic economy, all the investment we need is going to be done by the government. Some of it must in infrastructure, and if they can do that, that's good. But a lot of it has to be a revival of a dynamic private sector, etc. There are many reasons why the private sector is stuck. Problems with the banks is one of them. Look, industrial credit growth is negative. Now, I don't care what they say about 1 quarter's GDP, but the idea that we're going to get an industrial revival, unless the banks can start lending, is just simply not credible. Can the banks start lending? There's a lot of mistaken notion that just because of demonetization, a lot of money has gone into the banks, now they can lend. The truth is, all of this money is going to go back again because the demand for cash is still going to be there as soon as they remove all these restrictions. But in any case, since the banks have limits on their capital adequacy, the bank's capital is impaired. So even if they had liquidity, they would be better advised to put it in government securities rather than expand lending. That's the problem of how to fix the non-performing assets. Those are really difficult questions. And I've not seen, it's now beginning to be talked about. I've been in favor of setting up what they call a bad bank. I said that earlier. Now I find one or two of the people, the new Deputy Governor, Viral Acharya, has said we should do something like that. Arvind Subramaniam has said we should do something like that. So, in 2 months, will we have an answer? If you're still talking about it a year from now, that would be really bad.
But Montek, that actually brings me to that other burning question, which is the non-performing assets. And, it's a sleight of hand, how easily one speaks of a bad bank, how politely one calls it non-performing assets. Surjit Bhalla, every time I pose this question to him, he goes ballistic. And I'm sure you're not going to like that question either. But this really is an inheritance that the UPA passed on to the NDA. And I mentioned that figure, it's $43 billion. We're talking about 30 defaulters that account for pretty much 1/3 of that. We were talking about 70,000 crores for a farm loan waiver, which created so much of noise in television studios and in the drawing rooms of India, that India can't afford these subsidies. One company, and I'm not going to name those companies, but I could reel off just 6 or 7 companies. Each company's bad loans is twice the figure of what we have, writing off the farm loan, sending 30 missions to Mars, the entire midday program of feeding millions of children, 2 crore children in India. One company owes that to the banks. So when you're saying that the banks can't lend further, that crisis really has been created collectively by the banks, the governments, and the private sector. When you're not willing to write off other people's loans, why are we talking so easily about creating bad banks that will write off irresponsible spending,
That's very good. By the way, I mean, clearly a lot of the problem with assessing performance is that, you can never be sure when something good started or when something bad started. So forget about UPA, it's a problem. What do we do about it? The first point is that this problem has been known ever since Raghuram Rajan pointed his finger at it in the year 2015. So really, the name of the game is whoever's the government in power, the question is how long does it take for you to have a reasonable answer? 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, whatever it is, I would say that 6 months from now, I'm being generous, it should actually be 3 months from now, we should have a complete game plan. What are we going to do about these loans? Now, when you say bad loans, I don't think you should assume that each of these guys has just run away with the money and salted. They may have done some of that, but effectively what's happened is that money has been lent to projects. I'm sure that some of it may have been salted away. A lot of it has just run bad because projects have gone into delay, because there are short-term downturns, so you need to ride that somehow. The banks themselves have probably lent too much, not enough due diligence. So what do you do? Now, I mean, clearly, you have to have first thing is you've got to have a haircut on the promoter, because the first hit should be equity. Now, the banks are in a position today, in all these companies, to basically displace the management, which basically means that they lose their equity, and then look for someone else to run the banks, run the project. The problem is that in many of these cases, they've lent so much money that even after the promoter has taken a big hit, i.e. lost his equity, the banks have to write off some of the loans, otherwise the project's not viable. That's what's not happening. Now, one of the reasons it's not happening is that people say, well, it's not enough for the guy to lose his equity because he's got all this other money somewhere. I mean, his other assets. Now, if that was not pledged, there's no point saying you have this and you have the other. You should seize whatever assets you can, get rid of the guy, bid the project out, but that will still only be viable if the banks recognize that 1/3 of their debt has to be written off. How to get them to do that is the problem. It's a very simple thing that, if I'm a bank manager, senior bank manager, whatever it is, most of the bank managers are going to retire in another 6 months or 8 months or 9 months. So if I can just keep kicking the can down the road, it'll be somebody else's problem. Nobody is actually willing to write it off at this point. That's where a bad bank comes in. And the advantage of a bad bank is simply that you set up some mechanism where the amount of the bank's debt that is written off is sort of decided in some way with the government. Maybe this new bank boards bureau or something can step in, so that the managers are not the ones that are held responsible. And then this so-called bad bank tries to find new promoters. Of course, many of the existing promoters would say that they shouldn't be kicked out entirely. Now, my view would be that equity should take the first hit. That's absolute. What you could have is, if you think that the promoter wasn't a willful bad guy, he just got caught on the wrong foot, when you're bidding out the project, let him also bid for it. So if somebody else says, listen, if you've written off this much debt, I'm willing to put in 500 crores into this project, let the existing promoter say, no, I'll put in 550. So you have a competitive process. Now, I'm just sketching the idea. This could be easily looked at and accepted or rejected in 2 weeks' time. What I fear is that we'll be here next year with everybody discussing this and no decisions taken. That'll be terrible.
But Montek, I sound, every time I have these economic conversations, it's probably because one is trying to put a wedge in the door in the consensus, and it's really of trying to bring outside voices in. So there is no doctrinaire opposition to, large-scale manufacturing, corporate activity, any of that. The thing that I would really like to pose is that, why is this vocabulary not ascribed to just smaller entrepreneurs? When a smaller entrepreneur fails, they just fail. Why is it that we have allowed some institutions to become so large that you're not allowed to allow them to fail? And we saw that in America, and we're seeing that in India, and we're not looking it in the eyes. So we call it very polite terms. But the truth is, what do we mean by someone is not a willfully bad guy? I'm sure there are millions of entrepreneurs in this country who've gone bust, who were not willfully bad, but these courtesies were not extended to them,
No,
But
you're absolutely correct. I think it should be a level playing field. And when I said I mean, it's difficult to judge that, but most bankers will know when a person has either simply siphoned the money off or been a bit over-enthusiastic and the market turned down and therefore the project. I mean, steel, for example, is a classic. Every now and then steel prices go down, everybody's in trouble, then they pick up again and the fellows get out of trouble a little bit. But I agree with you that these things shouldn't just be done for the big guys. You need to have a similar approach for the smaller ones also.
in fact, we're going to run out of time soon, and I want to open it up for the audience. So just two questions. When you said about opening it up for the small guys, I was asking you that what is the heretical new idea? I mean, Keynes made a break from the mercantilism of the colonials to, the animal spirits of the market. And throughout history, there's been real breaks in economic thinking. Right now, when there seem to be so many imponderables in world economy and in India, every time you talk to economists, we seem to be circling the same pool, rather than the big new idea. So I'm going to pose that to you. But before we move on and I open this conversation to the audience, you mentioned about sustainability. And so I just want to come back to the great rift in the UPA was really between Sonia Gandhi's National Advisory Council and Mr. Manmohan Singh and his advisors, and there seemed to be literally a wall which brought the UPA down. On hindsight, and I remember Jairam Ramesh was pretty much blamed for bringing down India's GDP single-handedly, for raising environment issues. On hindsight, do you think that polarization was overplayed? Was it lack of political wisdom on the part of the growth walas? I know you hate that term. That actually history has proved that those were very legitimate concerns. Not only political concerns, but economic concerns.
Well, the short answer is all concerns are legitimate.
Don't give me the diplomatic answer.
No, I'm currently trying to write about my own experiences, and fortunately, I haven't got to the UPA bit yet. Even pre-UPA, it's quite difficult to come to a conclusion when you have different views. But I certainly think that the so-called conflict between the National Advisory Council and the rest of the government was overdone. Because let's face it, you mentioned Surjit Bhalla. Now, for example, he used to go ballistic at something like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. I, by the way, supported the National Rural Employment. My view was, what are we going to use it for? In other words, let's use it to take care of the water shortage in rural areas, etc. And interestingly, when the government changed, the same program that was regarded as being complete rubbish is regarded as being a very good program. So it stands the test of time from that point of view. I think they were very concerned about health. We were very concerned about health. We don't actually have a solution there. Because, the big dispute on health was, should you run a subsidized health insurance system? Or should you rely on free service by public sector hospitals? And I mean, we set up a group under Srinath Reddy. And actually, he's the head of the Public Health Foundation of India. And if you want a discussion on health, you should get him to one of these. Very good. But it's a huge dispute between people. Some people saying that health insurance is the wrong way of going about it. Others saying, no, the best thing is that let's have free health insurance for a certain basic amount and let people buy higher coverage if they want. But others said no.
But you skipped the environment question,
No, I think on the environment question, I feel the real problem was a complete lack of transparency in the norms. And I think, it was one of those things that, if an environment clearance is given and somebody comes and represents against it, then the environment clearance gets cancelled.
So it's the unreliability of it.
Yeah, I mean, whatever it is, you shouldn't reverse decisions that have been taken. If it's a wrong decision, well, make sure that in future you don't do the same thing. But I don't think those were, I think the environment clearances are not what held up infrastructure. It was a lot of the banking problems that were holding up it. So poor old Jairam was a little bit overblamed because, he had given hundreds of environment clearances. And if all the projects that had been cleared had moved ahead, we would be in very good shape.
Actually, he only had a 2% break, which, anyway, we'll come back to that. Let me open this up. From the audience, there are questions. With this kind of growth, why are government policies not working? What is your view from the inside? And that's a question from Sheila Vasan Singla.
Well, when you say, right now, we don't know what the current year's growth rate is. I said that during the previous 14 years or so, the average growth rate was about 7.7%. I don't think the current year's growth rate is that. Most people think we've gone below 7. So, below 7 may look good compared to what we were doing 15 years ago. But when you decelerate from 7.7 to maybe 6.5, a lot of people feel that that's not good performance. So I think there are problems. When the present government came in, I recall the finance minister saying that in that particular year, we can only do 7 point something, but then we'll go to 8, and then 8 to 10%. But we're nowhere near that. So I think the disappointment that people feel really relates to the desire to get a clear answer. Are we aiming at 8 to 10%? Are we happy with 7? Somebody should say, what is our growth, what is our target? And then we'll know.
Well, this is a good question. How do you see the difference between Planning Commission and Niti Aayog? Is it nomenclature or substantive? And that's a question from Navneet. And I'll just add one to that, do you also believe that the Planning Commission needed to be folded up?
Well, I was never of the view that the Planning Commission needed to be folded up, but I was very much of the view that it needed to be reformed. In fact, before leaving, Manmohan Singh had asked us that, listen, the world is changing. We're doing very different things in planning, which we were. And so you should think about what the Planning Commission should look like in future. And I had submitted a note to him, and I said, leave it to the next government. So the idea that nothing should have been done to the Planning Commission would be certainly not my view. I don't know what Niti Aayog does, so I can't compare.
That's a sweet cut.
No, but...
That's the first cut you've made, and it's at a professional level, not a political...
The way we were told, one way of judging, we were told that the Niti Aayog is going to produce, they're not going to produce a 5-year plan, but they're going to produce a 3-year plan and a 7-year plan and a 15-year plan. That's not bad. But I've not seen any one of these. So when they do that, then one will be able to judge. But the general proposition, which I'm in favor of, is that it's the policies that are much more important, not the money that you give this, that, and the other scheme. They're not doing any of that now. Okay, somebody else is doing it. The focus should be on policies. And I've not seen, I read in the newspaper that they're involved in this and involved in that, which is like a support staff. But I've not seen a big strategy document.
There's just so many unanswered questions, but here's one from Vishal Gupta. What, according to you, are the 3 key economic steps that should be taken by the current government?
Now that's a really... that one is a general step which any government should take, particularly when the world has become highly uncertain. You need to run a stable macroeconomy. So, people must feel that the fiscal situation of the country is in good shape. I think at the moment, my guess is that the central government's fiscal situation is okay. In the case of the state governments, I'm not so sure. Also, in the central government's case, we've made a number of, declared a number of intentions, but they're not being costed yet. So we don't know how this is going to be carried out, but that's very important. Because if the word goes out that the fiscal situation in India is out of control, in an open economy, you can see very serious distortions. Number 2, I think that the government has to spend a lot of energy in getting the infrastructure into proper shape. And a lot of that relates to the transport infrastructure, railways, and so on. There's been a lot of talk about what we're going to do in the railways. I'd just like to see whether this is happening in detail, the action on that. And the third most important thing is you've got to fix the banking system. I mean, we've discussed that at length, but like anybody making a list of questions, they should be told that, look, in 3 months we'll have an answer to all of these. And that would be reassuring. And finally, many good things have happened, you know, like the bankruptcy code, GST. I mean, these are not things that were invented yesterday. They're actually a continuation of what was going on. We've got to get them off the ground functioning efficiently. I think if we do that, then there will be some additional push to efficiency, which could get reflected in better growth rates.
Well, you know, we're back to talking growth rates, not talking employment. And so there's a good question here, which is that, you know, what can we do to create new jobs? And if a large part of our economy is informal, what's the big deal about? Like, is GDP an indicator, a real indicator of economic performance? What should be a real measure of our growth? Well, so 2 questions about jobs and GDP.
No, when I say GDP, I mean, you know, increasing GDP normally means that some employment will take place. Where the GDP increases can determine how much employment takes place. That's where, for example, if you get a lot more growth in the middle and small sector, if you get a lot more growth in agriculture, it'll generate more employment. If you get it only in a very capital-intensive part, you won't get that much employment. So don't de-link GDP from employment. What you need is more than just GDP. You need a lot of skilling and making people better skilled, not just for the jobs that exist today, but the kind of jobs that are going to become the only ones that will be available 5 and 10 years from now. That's a very big task that needs to be performed if you want the whole thing to function well.
But doesn't the falsity of that ring in your ear, Montek? You know, when you say the only jobs that will be available in the next 5, 10 years are really the knowledge economy jobs. And we're talking about 440 million Indians who are barely educated, you know, and the Modi government, I think rightly, constantly points fingers at the Congress governments that for 60 years it's the Congress that's been at the helm of power. And why are we in the mess that we are in today? So looking back, can you mark Mr. Manmohan Singh's governments and then the Congress governments over 60 years? What would you give them on 10?
Well, you know,
do it. It gives us an indication of how you think about it.
Well, as I said, if you're referring to the UPA period alone, that's from 2004 to 2014. I would certainly, on growth, I would give them 8 out of 10, okay? On inclusiveness, I would give them 5 to 6 out of 10. And on sustainability, maybe 3 out of 10. That's my ranking. Now, but let's be clear, when we talk about 60 years, I mean, you know, first of all, it hasn't been the Congress that's been in power. Yeah. I mean, Vajpayee ji was in power for at least 6 of those 60 years. There are all kinds of other governments too. And I don't think that you should be, I don't share the view that nothing has been achieved during this period. I mean, which sometimes you hear. But yes, if you look at the last 14, I think in many ways a good performance, but you know, in others could have been a lot better.
Okay, so one last question before, you know, we'll have to close down. You have a wedding to attend. Is that, you know, what about the question of employability? We are constantly talking about the demographic dividend, but I've shared some shock figures again, and you know them to be true, that quite apart from the fact that there are no jobs, mostly we are not even employable. So where do you see the jobs coming from in the future?
Yeah, well, actually, I think some of you...
And that was a question from Vinita Chawla.
Yeah, some of the numbers you gave, I can have teeny quarrels with, but not with the broad picture, that there are big deficiencies here, and we need to do something about it. Certainly, as far as jobs are concerned, you know, I'm not saying that everybody's going to work for Infosys and Wipro, but I'm just saying that, as I gave you that example, that, you know, many more of what you call taxi rides would be Ola and Uber and not regular taxis. So you've got to recognize that you've got to be a lot more nimble. And in the service industry, a whole new categories of jobs will get created, which maybe don't exist today. But you need to be trained for those jobs. And what we don't have at the moment is a sufficiently good system of skilling. I know that the previous government had done something, the present government has emphasized the same. There's a new Ministry of Skill Development. But I'm not a great believer that ministries solve the problem. I mean, I think if that was the case, every problem would have been solved, because we have about 3 times as many ministries as make sense. So we should be cautious on that. But it is a genuine question. Who's going to be teaching people the right skills?
Well, you spoke about Uber. At this very moment, Google and others are creating driverless cars, so technology is going to catch up with us. I'm going to end with just one personal question, Montek, that when you were in the Planning Commission, you were both an admired and feared figure. Looking back at yourself, what is the one thing you would say was your big legacy of the 8-10 years that you helmed or helped helm Indian economy? What's the one good thing that you did?
Well, I don't think the Planning Commission is a helming. It's more like putting a lot of things together and articulating, because it's not a functioning ministry. I mean, I was more directly involved in the liberalization in the 90s because I was then in a functioning ministry. So I think the Planning Commission was more taking an overview, giving some broad directions. I think some of the things we did were the right things. I mean, let's say we give a big push to the basic idea that if you want to create infrastructure in the country, it has to be through public-private partnership. Government doesn't have enough money. This was quite controversial at that time. It's now widely accepted. The present government accepts it, state governments accept it, and in general, if you look at airports, I mean, the airports that have been set up by the private sector are functioning a lot better than the airports that are being run by the Airport Authority of India. So you could roll that out big time across the country.
So, and do you feel safe in Mr. Arun Jaitley's hands?
Well, I think, finance ministers always deserve a very...
I'm amazed at how diplomatic the Congress and its affiliates always are. You never give a hard answer.
Well, because, poor finance ministers are always blamed for everything. But so far, I would say that, fiscal responsibility, if you judge anywhere in the world, the finance minister is ultimately judged by, is the fiscal situation being reasonably under control? And I think the fiscal situation has been reasonably under control. I would say that my biggest disappointment, and I've written about this, and that's not Jaitley's fault, it's also the state governments. I think the most important reform that is actually about to happen is the GST. Now, everybody knows that to really get 2% growth out of a good GST, it should have 1 rate or maybe 2. We've ended up with 5. I mean, Arvind Subramaniam recommended 3. Well, that's fair enough. Then the finance ministry made it 4. And then the GST council has made it 5. I'd still say that, because now is the finance minister of India is really the GST council, because on indirect taxes, they decide. If they get this done, they should have a 3-year program to reduce these 5 rates to 2 or 3, maybe after the general election. That would be a really great signal if they would do it right now,
And we're going to stop now because we're really running out of time, but there are 2 things which I'm going to leave just in the air, which was that, Mr. Manmohan Singh has often said that he left his seat of power as a reviled man on many counts, and that history would judge him more kindly. And the other question I would have loved to hear you on is that in 1991, we made a big rupture, a big new idea through which India reinvented itself. Is 2017 or the next year, really, are we reaching that sort of milestone when we need the big rupture idea to really rethink the way we look at Indian economy? That's a question that still hangs in the air, and hopefully we'll have Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia back to answer some of those questions. But the Indian economy is a big, big question. We didn't touch global economy, but we've got some insights into why Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia feels that India is buoyant, despite all the dark figures that we threw out. And so I'm feeling a little more hopeful than I began this evening. Thank you very, very much, Montek, for being here. At the risk of becoming a highly unpopular figure in this community, I would still, though, like to just leave on the table the thought that a lot of the elite conversation does not ever take in the actual realities of the 90% of India that remains unrepresented in our economic conversations. And that has been some of the effort of Algebra's Masters of Economy series. We've already had Mr. Chidambaram and Surjit Bhalla and Montek, and we're going to keep inviting more and more economists to grapple with these questions. Thank you very much, Montek.
Thank you, sir.
We'll take a very, very short break, and then, of course, we have another master on stage. So quickly refill your drinks, and we'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you so much.